Right, well, good morning. Last week we talked about the mission of Jesus and how we are all on God's guest list. This series is called God's Guest List, right? And Jesus said he had come to bring good news to all people, including those who are poor, who are marginalised, who are sick, excluded from society. And in this week's passage that we just read, we see that Jesus is doing literally just that, healing the sick, a leper, an absolute outcast from society. And this leper came to him in great need. So I thought that we would start with a few basics about leprosy, which this may be familiar to some of you, but it's not a disease that we really have in New Zealand. There are a couple of cases a year, mostly from immigration, and they're dealt with really effectively with medicine. So now it's known as Hansen's disease, and we have very little in New Zealand, so you may not be familiar with it. It wasn't always this way in New Zealand, and New Zealand was among many countries that really feared this disease and feared the spread of it and outbreaks of leprosy infection. And so it took steps to contain it. So in 1906 to 1925, on Quail Island in Lyttelton Harbour in New Zealand, that was the site of New Zealand's only leprosy colony. This is a little history lesson, I guess. And the fate of those who ended up on that island was pretty grim. I mean, there was a lack of care, there were reports of institutional abuse. There were 14 men in total that were sent there, and when it was closed, 9 men went to an island in Fiji where they lived out the rest of their days. Such is the stigma of this disease. Many other countries have very similar stories of this. So in Japan, in 1953, they introduced a leprosy prevention law, and Japan rounded up thousands of patients with leprosy and sent them to sanatoriums in the mountains or on islands where they lived, and that law was not repealed until 1996. And for a beautiful film that tells a fictional story of one woman who lived in one of those sanatoriums, I can recommend the film Sweet Bean. It is subtitled, but in Japanese, and it's an absolutely stunning film. Actually about red bean paste, but there you go, spoiler alert. In 2001 in Japan, that law was ruled unconstitutional, and patients' families are now seeking compensation. And these measures and this reaction to a disease may seem very extreme to us, or maybe not, having gone through COVID perhaps, but they do demonstrate this great fear and this great stigma that surrounds leprosy and has surrounded it for a very, very long time. And in many countries, this treatable disease is still a major health challenge, and it causes tragic deformities and disfigurement, particularly among the world's most poor and vulnerable communities. So the leprosy mission is working to eradicate it worldwide by 2035. So if you want to support them, I just put, I think, a slide about them, and they have an amazing mission. Which is the next slide, I hope. And leprosy has always carried this stigma, I think, seems, ever since the rules that were introduced that we see in Leviticus 13 and 14. So lepers in Leviticus were required to live outside the camp, and they were to be completely isolated from the community, and they had to shout unclean to anyone who came near them. And so anyone who touched them also became unclean. So they were completely ostracized from their community. Whether that was fear of contagion or what the reason behind that was, this was a completely outcast group of people. And the priests were in charge of diagnosing and assessing if something was leprosy or a skin disease or whether it was contagious. And they got to rule on whether a person had to be quarantined or isolated, and all the rules are there, or whether they were in fact cured of their disease. And all of those regulations are in Leviticus 13 to 14, which we studied earlier this year. Did you miss that bit? Anyway, now we need to understand as well when we come to this passage that not everything that was called leprosy was actually leprosy. Leprosy covers a whole variety of skin diseases, skin ailments, okay? So in first century Palestine, it's also possible that they didn't follow all those laws of Leviticus absolutely strictly. So we see that when we read about Simon, that Jesus goes to eat in the house of Simon the leper. So how could that be if Simon was a leper and should be outside the community? Maybe he was healed. Maybe that became an identifier for him. We don't really know, but there are these sort of different stories. We think of Naaman in the Old Testament, who was a servant of the king and in the king's presence. Well, you know, there are these what's that word? Anomalies, things. Yeah, but there is no doubt that leprosy carried this stigma. And in our reading today, it seems very clear that this was a very severe case of leprosy or skin disease, with all the isolation and the distress that that carried with it. And it's also important to note that leprosy was often viewed as not just making the person ritually unclean and anyone who touched them, but it was also often seen as a punishment of some sort for sin that that person or their family had committed. So maybe you'd done something really bad in your life and there, bingo, you got leprosy. That was a consequence. So it was a living death, really. And I have to say, as I was researching this, it reminded me very much of AIDS in the 1980s. The epidemic of AIDS as it came in was seen as very much a consequence of sin. So this story was quite an emotive story. Luke uses very emotive language here to paint a picture of the interaction between this man and Jesus. And I want us to pay attention to the characters in this story. So verse 12, in one of the villages, Jesus met a man with an advanced case of leprosy. When the man saw Jesus, he bowed with his face to the ground, begging to be healed. Lord, he said, if you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean. We see a very vulnerable and desperate man here. He bows, face to the ground. That's low, very low. This is more than polite. He's begging, he's imploring Jesus, really. There's an urgency to his plea that he is begging Jesus to heal him. And notice this isn't about capability. It's not about whether Jesus can heal or is able to heal him. It's, is Jesus willing to do this? There is this vulnerability here. He's putting himself completely at the mercy of Jesus' whims, even, if you like. There's a pathos here contained in these words. And also using the word clean, you can heal me and make me clean, throws a spiritual focus on the whole incident. So it's not solely about physical healing as well. So the man sees and feels himself as unclean. Perhaps he'd lived so long with this disease, because it does say it's an advanced case of leprosy, has burdened him with the guilt, and he really feels that weight of that sin with a capital S, basically, within himself. And this could have been from the societal expectations and the ostracism that he'd lived with. You've got leprosy, you must have done something really bad, you're a sinner type thing. Or it could have been his own recognition or an acknowledgement of something in his life. Certainly, a physical ailment combined with being cut off from the spiritual community would drive that message home on a very regular basis. So the man wants to be cleaned from his abnormal and polluted condition. He's been shunned, he's been ostracized, he's humble, he is desperate, he's vulnerable, he sees himself as unwell, unclean, and sinful. And he puts himself at the feet of Jesus and he begs Jesus to fix him. He addresses him as Lord, but this isn't a recognition of Jesus as Messiah or the Son of God or even necessarily divine, because the disciples weren't even up to that yet. The disciples had barely even been called at this point in Luke. So the man recognizes Jesus as a prophet of some sort, someone who can help him if he is willing. The man is unsure how Jesus will react to this and what he will do. And I wonder if you have been in that place with Jesus, where you have been vulnerable and unsure and needy, where you've sensed your own unworthiness and desperation, where you've placed yourself at the mercy of Jesus, right in front of him, and begged him to heal you, to fix you. What was Jesus' reaction to this? Verse 13, Jesus reached out and touched him. I am willing, he said, be healed. And instantly the leprosy disappeared. Jesus could have just spoken, but he reaches out and touches the man. He breaks that barrier of the unclean rule. Jesus reaches out, and rather than being contaminated or made unclean by the man, instead Jesus heals the man and makes him clean. Mark tells us in his version of the story in chapter 1, verse 42, that Jesus is moved with compassion. Luke doesn't say that he's moved with compassion, but it's clear by his actions that he is. And it's hard to imagine just how much that touch would have meant to that man in that situation. I'm not sure we place that much value on touch in our society. We've become much more touch averse in recent years, and for good reason. I mean, there's inappropriate touching and unwanted or unasked for touching in workplaces and around children, etc. And it's important to have those safeguards in place. But physical human touch is an essential part of connection, of belonging. And part of leprosy, if this was in fact leprosy, that we understand it, is the loss of feeling in nerves and nerve endings. So essentially the loss of sensitivity to touch. And I can't help but liken this situation again to the 80s, when the AIDS epidemic had really taken hold in the West. And there was huge shame and stigma surrounding AIDS. But in April 1987, at the height of that epidemic, while many turned away and ignored what was happening, Princess Diana opened the UK's first specialist HIV/AIDS unit at London's Middlesex Hospital. And this was a space that would care exclusively for patients with the virus. And while she was there, she was pictured shaking hands with a patient with no gloves on, which in today's terms we would say broke the internet, but the internet wasn't there. Or we could say it went viral, but that was just a bit too far. But because no one would touch people with AIDS, because everyone was petrified that you could catch it from physical touch, from touching someone. And so while visiting the unit, she famously noted, HIV does not make people dangerous, you know. You can shake their hands, give them a hug. Heaven knows they need it. What's more, you can share their homes, their workplaces, and their playgrounds and toys. I mean, such shame that in that photo, you'll notice the person is not visible. There's no, I'm taking a selfie with Princess Diana. There was none of that. This is deliberately obscured because the shame of having this disease was such that you would not want to be known. I mean, some of you will remember a little girl who contracted it from a blood transfusion as a newborn and was expelled from her preschool in Australia, Eve van Grafhorst. And her family immigrated to Hastings and she was welcomed and accepted in New Zealand, where the preschool was hugely petrified that she had bitten a child and that someone would catch AIDS from that. So Princess Diana used her power. She's an example of someone who used her power and her position to show compassion and demonstrated how to treat an extremely shunned and ostracised group with dignity and respect. And she did this with the very simple human gesture of touch. Luke often mentions touch throughout his gospel, which is like a confirmation of Jesus' care for people and a reminder of the reality of his humanity. And the healing is instant and it's complete. There are no half measures. There's nothing that the man has to go and do. He's not like Naaman in the Old Testament who had to go and wash in the Jordan. He doesn't have to do anything in particular. He is immediately and completely healed or made clean, it says in the NIV. In verse 14, then Jesus instructed him not to tell anyone what had happened. He said, "Go to the priest and let him examine you. Take along the offering required in the law of Moses for those who've been healed of leprosy. This will be a public testimony that you have been cleansed." And it's not quite clear why Jesus tells the man not to tell anybody. Clearly, he wants him to be cleared by the priest first and for the man to make the appropriate sacrifices. That process took a week, actually. And Jesus often tells people not to spread the news about him, not to tell about his miracles, especially in this first half of Luke. And we see in the next verse that Kyla read how effective that was, not actually. Everybody came. Everybody knew. So maybe Jesus wanted the priests to know, in particular, that something was up, that there was a prophet. But there's been no conflict with the priests up until this point in the gospel. There's been no interactions that we see later on in the very next story, in fact. So maybe whichever priest the man showed himself to, maybe that went around and then That was it. Next miracle, they were there. They were out in force. Because in verse 15 we read, "But despite Jesus' instructions, the report of his power spread even faster, and vast crowds came to hear him preach and to be healed of their diseases." And this is the mission that we talked about last week in chapter 4. It's starting to be fulfilled. People are coming for healing. They're coming to hear Jesus. The excitement, the anticipation of a new prophet, the miracle worker, it echoes and ripples and expands. And as we go through Luke, we see more and more people are drawn to Jesus. This is the reaction of people to Jesus. But what is Jesus' reaction to this? To this fame, to this adoration, to this overwhelming need and desire for his presence, for his teaching, for his touch. How does he react? Well, in verse 16, we read, Jesus often withdrew to the wilderness for prayer. So Jesus turns to refreshment from his Father. And in spite of, or perhaps because of the crowds, Jesus doesn't seek this platform, this fame that he's been given. He doesn't pursue it. He doesn't think, oh, well, make hay while the sun shines. I've only got a few years perhaps, so best I get out there healing everybody before I get cancelled. He's not in that space. He withdraws. He seeks his Father's replenishment in prayer consistently. And that relationship is more important to him than even all the people coming. Even if he'd spent every waking minute of his time, there would still have been more people to heal, to come. But the most important thing for him to do, for Jesus to do, was to focus on what direction and purpose he had from the Father. So looking at the character of Jesus in the story, we see he is also humble. While he's also famous, he's intensely compassionate, he's prophetic and powerful, but he doesn't seek or pursue that power. And while he's authoritative, he respects the law. He tells the man to go to the priests. And he's also contemplative. He is one who is deliberate about spending time with God. And so we looked at the man before, and we observed that he was also humble, desperate, vulnerable. He sees himself as unwell, unclean, and sinful, despite being shunned and ostracized. But there's another character here that's not mentioned or talked about, but is clearly there. The villagers or the crowds. There's a narrator here. There's an observer. Someone is telling the story. We could include the priests in here. They are witnesses of this miracle. And they also react and respond. Some react with joy and persistence, and they start to follow Jesus, and they stick with him throughout his whole ministry, while others come to criticize and harass him. So the question for us today is, where do you see yourself in this story? Who do you identify with? Do you see yourself like the leper, desperately begging Jesus to fix you, to heal you? You might suffer from some physical ailment, and you're in a really hard place with Jesus right now. You're imploring him to heal you. Maybe you're wondering and struggling with questions as to why that hasn't happened. Why don't I get to be healed instantly like the leper? Maybe you feel unclean like the leper. You know you desperately need Jesus, and you're not sure if Jesus would reach out and touch you, if he could even fix you. If he wants you, he can, and he does. He wants you, and he wants to fix you. Or maybe you're one of the crowds. Maybe you're curious, and you follow at a distance. You're non-committal. Or maybe you want to harass and question and interrogate this Jesus. Who is he? What is he doing and saying? How is he relevant today, in this time? But in the crowds are followers as well, faithful witnesses who take the words and deeds of Jesus and then tell others. And the words that they say and the things that they do point towards Jesus, so that when people see those actions and hear those words, they hear and they see Jesus. So maybe you know that Jesus has healed you. You know that he has fixed you, and you want to be like him. You want to be like Jesus for others. You want to reach out with compassion to touch others and offer the healing that Jesus offers. You're ready to embrace all of those who Jesus embraced, all of those that he included, everyone on his guest list. Wherever you're at today, you have a place in this story. You might not be an outcast like the leper, but Jesus wants to touch you and heal you just the same today. You can choose to be his follower, and he will use you to bring compassion and healing to those who need it, so that Jesus will be seen through what you do and through who you are. Let's pray. Dear Lord, I thank you for your word. I thank you for your care and the compassion that you reached out and you touched those in need without fear and without shame. Lord, I thank you that you accept us just as you accepted the leper that day. When we are desperate and we come begging to you, you reach out to us with compassion and love. Lord, I pray today for you to cleanse us and heal us. Help us to see you and obey your voice. I pray that we will continue to follow you and bring your compassion to those we meet, that we will show your love and your healing to those who are vulnerable and most in need of you. In your holy name we pray. Amen.